last week I introduced the lesser-known Stoic philosopher, Musonius Rufus, who, as I said, was the teacher behind Epictetus, Marcus Aurelius, and the major Stoic philosophers, which we know to this present day. Rufus is characterized by his much more practical approach to Stoicism, and which for us will be quite a fresh take on core Stoic ideas. And so I got a lot of emails from a number of you who said, wouldn't we just have a look again at some of those core Stoic ideas? So here tonight I'm showing an episode I first showed 4 years ago, which introduces the most basic core Stoic ideas and Stoic philosophy. And then in the weeks ahead we'll be able to look at how those ideas stem from Rufus and are elaborated by him. So enjoy a review of the core ideas of Stoicism. You know, I am frequently asked about philosophies of life and what to believe and how should we navigate this very difficult path of life. What is the book or the philosophy that is our guide? And of course there is no one answer to that. Everyone comes to their own understandings, everyone finds their own path, or at least should be seeking it, and everyone will find something different is capable of giving the answers. Certainly one thing I've always been pretty sure of, and that is that there isn't one magical text somewhere belonging to some magical culture somewhere that has all the answers. It's never made sense to me that there should be one revelation of some kind to one tiny little group somewhere on earth and somewhere in history, and then everyone else gets to seek, kill, die, and be confused for thousands and thousands of years. That much never made sense to me. And certainly what has made the most sense to me is the efforts of thinkers and philosophers throughout the ages to try and solve the dilemma of what is it to be human, what does it mean, and even what obligations does that imply, what is a human being, how do we live this very difficult life. In fact, philosophy, think of the ancient Greeks and so on, philosophy was not meant to be some metaphysical solution to the world. It wasn't really just the effort to say what is the meaning of life. Philosophy was really always predicated on the idea of searching for a practical way to live, how to be human in a difficult or confusing world. So what I want to share with you today is a philosophy that I believe that has those answers for many people today in the type of modern world that we live in. And I have found the Stoics to be one of the best ways for the modern mind to deal with this question. Buddhism is frequently cited as a spiritual philosophy that particularly suits the Western mind, which inclines to be rational or seek rational answers. But it remains a religious philosophy, and I think Stoicism manages to stand a little bit outside of a metaphysical worldview and allows us to find answers in a more rational way. And by rational I don't mean it excludes the aspects of the soul and the metaphysical, not at all. It just doesn't go there. It's a little bit like astrology. What you believe about where the universe comes from, if someone created it and who and why, all of those things are independent of astrology and pretty much independent of the philosophy of Stoicism. Whether you believe in God or not is not really relevant to what Stoicism is about, because Stoicism is a practical philosophy that really helps us live, it helps us deal with the world, it helps us with how we should treat other people, and perhaps most importantly, it helps us deal with death of others and prepare to die ourselves. Because especially in this world today, where people are less certain religiously speaking, and where people have much larger, more rational, and frequently atheist even, points of view, dealing with the problem of death becomes a much bigger problem, because the usual answers don't really work. So we'll see in the episodes ahead how Stoicism also helps us deal with the fact that everyone dies. So it seems on the whole to be suitable to the widest range of people in our modern times. It's something that I resonate with very strongly, and that's why I'll be introducing you to Stoicism tonight, giving you a couple of exercises in how to start thinking in the Stoic mindset, and also in various episodes to come we will get more deeply into it. So something that is important about Stoicism, as you might be beginning to realize, is that it's largely based in a rational kind of philosophy of natural cause. It is not based on the idea that the universe is entirely materialistic. In fact, perhaps it implies that it isn't, but certainly it is based on the idea that the universe is rational and that it follows natural causes. There are causes and effects. These are natural and rational and can be understood by us when we apply ourselves in a rational manner. So, what's really interesting about it as a modern philosophy is that firstly, it is of course over 2,000 years old, originally coming from the Greek Zeno, although as we understand Stoicism today, it tends to be the slightly later Roman version that dates from mostly the 2nd century AD. And you might think, 2nd century AD, isn't that getting a little bit old? Well, of course that's true for so much of our philosophy and our religions, I won't even go there. But what is important about that is that the human condition hasn't changed. We know from reading the Greek dramatists and in fact the Greek philosophers that the human condition has not changed. Although our technologies have changed and things around us have changed, we haven't changed that much. And it really turns out, as you'll see, that when you listen to what the Stoics were talking about, it really seems to make sense to us who have this evidence-based culture. In fact, there are many even therapies, psychotherapies, that are kind of evidence-based, that are based really rooted in the ideas of Stoicism. The most common being, most notable being, the cognitive therapy of Viktor Frankl. And Frankl famously survived the concentration camps in the Holocaust during the Second World War and wrote a book called Man's Search for Meaning, which dealt with how do you deal with yourself and with life in the horrific circumstances of finding yourself in a concentration camp, a Nazi concentration camp. And so Frankl developed a way of thinking that helped one deal with that is largely rooted in the philosophy of Stoicism. When you say Stoicism, people tend to think you mean keeping a stiff upper lip. And, keeping a stiff upper lip, being stoic about it all, gets you through everything. And although that use of the word certainly derives from the idea of Stoicism, it must not be confused with Stoicism. It's not about being Mr. Spock or anything like that. It's really about reflection. Stoics are not unemotional. They reflect on their emotions. They ask themselves what causes that emotion. Is there anything I can do about what causes that emotion? Is there anything I can find that has value in the emotion itself? And perhaps then I need to question, why am I going on about it? Why am I continuously going through that experience? It's a very powerful thought. So it's not about blocking or denying emotion. It's essentially about reflecting on it, asking what caused it. Can I have any influence on what caused it? And if not, what is the purpose of this emotion? That's a really fine question to ask yourself almost any time. So, the interesting thing as well is in terms of who does this philosophy apply to, is to look at who it came from. I said Zeno was the origin of Stoicism, but two of the greatest exponents whose works still survive today and are profoundly influential. The one perhaps best known today is Marcus Aurelius, the Roman emperor living in the 2nd century. He ruled the Roman Empire. He was a great military emperor, like so many of them were, and he kept a journal of his own thoughts, which is now later, since a couple of hundred years after his death, to the present day, known as the Meditations of Marcus Aurelius. My favorite book for a very long time. I'm constantly going back to it, and that is the book I most strongly recommend in terms of the basics of Stoic philosophy. It's not an instruction book, it's literally reflections and thoughts gathered in a loose fashion, not in any textbook-like fashion or so on. But you'll discover yourself, if you go out and get a copy of it, that it has pithy bits of wisdom all over the place, that sometimes you read one and you just stop for the rest of the day and you think, I get it, I actually feel better. And Stoic philosophy doesn't make us feel better by pacifying us in any kind of way. It just makes things so eminently reasonable. So Marcus Aurelius was a great emperor whose work we still read today. The other one, in fact, who was one of his teachers, was Epictetus. And Epictetus was in fact a Roman slave who was later freed and who educated himself and became a great teacher of philosophy and of Stoic philosophy in particular. So a slave and an emperor, the two great sources of Stoic philosophy, really demonstrate how it is a philosophy that suits everyone. Already inherent in what I've said about emotions is the underlying core tenet of Stoic philosophy, and that is that it's essentially about navigating the world as best as we can and trying to be virtuous and good, or as often said, excellent, not just being a good person, being good at what you do. So it's about being virtuous and excellent, trying to live the world to the best of our abilities while being aware of, on the one hand, the moral dimensions of our actions, and on the other hand, recognizing the difference between what we can and can't control. That is so key. It's about recognizing the difference between what we can and can't control. Similarly, it's even about recognizing the difference between what we can and can't master. In Stoic philosophy, we describe 4 basic virtues. The first virtue is wisdom, and wisdom is really the navigating of complex situations in the best available fashion. Instead of reacting to them, becoming emotional, or having opinions or preconceived ideas or any of those kind of things, it's really about doing the best possible thing under the circumstances. So virtue number 1, wisdom. Virtue number 2 is courage, doing the right thing under all circumstances. Like many philosophies, Stoicism is also a moral philosophy and says how to be a virtuous human being. So doing the right thing under all circumstances, which will then encompass not being selfish and not being harmful, for example, as 2 basic virtues. Which leads to the third virtue, which is justice. The third virtue of justice is basically to treat all people the same, equally, fairly, and kindly. And finally, the fourth virtue is temperance, moderation in all things. We certainly know that to be a very important philosophy from many schools in ancient times. So moderation in all things allows us to lead a more balanced and temperate life. This leads us to the 3 basic principles of Stoicism. And the first of those principles is that virtue is the highest good. Being moral, being ethical, doing things right, trying to be good, that is the highest good to which we will aspire over our whole lives. Secondly is apply the rules of nature to the rules of social life. The rules of nature is unnecessary harm is never caused. Animals generally will try and live peacefully amongst their fellow species of the same species. As far as possible, conflict will be avoided unless it's necessary in some way. So everything in nature works on necessity. Otherwise, there's no value in doing it, and it's a waste of energy and resources. So we'll get back to that in some of the principles we see in the various episodes we'll do on this in the coming weeks. And thirdly, and I think this is by far the most important principle in Stoicism, and that is concern yourself only with what is under your control. Handle everything else with equanimity. Try not react and respond too much to those things which are not under your control. By far the most important of those is that last principle of understanding what is within your control and what isn't. It is perhaps the single most important contribution of the Stoic philosophy, because essentially it says that everything outside of yourself is not in control by you. The world is not under your control. What happens is not under your control. What other people do is not under your control. There's so much that's not under your control. Even so much of what you do is not under your control. But what is under your control is what stems from inside you, your reactions and your responses. That is where your control lies, and that's where the great value of the philosophy lies, and how much it can teach us in terms of how to live an easier life by understanding the difference between what's under your control and what isn't. So that's going to lead us to the first of the exercise. This is suggested by the modern Stoic philosopher Massimo Pagliucci. And he says the first thing you can do to kind of get into the understanding of the Stoic mindset is to examine your impressions. When things happen, examine your impressions and separate the thing that happened or whatever it is from your reaction, so that you can then be rational about the thing. Take the drama out. Then ask yourself the question, is this under my control? If the answer is yes, then do something about it. If the answer is no, then you must accept it or move on. But there's nothing you can do. Understanding when there's nothing you can do is one of the most important things you will learn. So examine your reaction, take the drama out, just look at what it was that just happened, then ask yourself if it's under control, your control, and if it is, do something. If it isn't, you've got to say, it's not under my control. There is nothing I can do about that. Ranting and raving and screaming and crying is no point. When a machine does something stupid and we scream and shout, does the machine care? When we go outside and it's freezing cold and the car won't start, and we scream at the weather and we scream at the car, does the car care? Does the weather care? They're indifferent. So once you realize you're wasting a lot of your energy in ranting and raving, it's a good idea to not go there. And then from the stuff that happens even in our everyday lives, when real stuff happens, when tragedies happen, when things in everyday life outside of our control, even if they're in the control of another human being, they're not in your control. So you may as well say, there's no point in me getting angry. There's no point in me getting anxious. There's no point in me worrying about things I cannot control. So, as I've said, that the one promise of Stoicism is it helps us eventually separate ourselves from those kind of things. It helps us eventually see the difference between what we control and what we don't control. The second thing that I spoke about was intention. And when setting an intention, and that is something you want to do, the important thing is to keep what your will is aligned with what nature says. In other words, with what's possible. It doesn't mean we mustn't stretch ourselves, but the Stoics point out that you also need to know the difference between what you're capable of and what you're not capable of. And if you understand that difference, you can become much more effective and powerful at what you are capable of. There isn't an endless array of possibilities for everyone, even though sometimes we're brought up to believe that. And there isn't a level playing field, which means that everything is possible to all people. It isn't really like that at all. Clearly, there's some things some of us can do and some things we can't do. And if we know the difference between those two things, we can become very powerful at what we do. If we don't, we often become jack of all trades or dilettante or whatever it may be. So the question is, how does this fit in with what is naturally possible to me and in this situation? And even, if you like, to fate, for want of a better word, to call it fate. So what's possible to me and what's possible in terms of the bigger picture. If you accept that fate permitting, or God willing, or if nature allows, or however your worldview describes, that there is something bigger than you, if you allow for that, then it stops you thinking that bad things keep on happening to you. So understand your limitations when setting your intention. You will be much less disappointed and much more successful. The other thing that I alluded to was that Stoicism helps us understand the reality of death, of our own death, and of death of people and animals and those that we love around us. So I also wanted to give you a taste of that exercise to set you going. And all you really need to do is remind yourself that everything is impermanent, that everything does die. Marcus Aurelius says that every day you must tell yourself that the ones you love will die. Tell yourself that they will die. When you see them, say to yourself in your head, you're going to be dead one day. And it sounds ridiculous and harsh and cruel, but it's a powerful exercise in teaching you to love what is there now, to love who is there now. There's a lot of hallmark cliches about loving someone while you can because you don't know if they're going to be there tomorrow. And those hallmark cliches are based on a core philosophical idea from Stoicism that is about attachment. If you understand that the world is impermanent, that it is full of changes that you have absolutely no control over, then you can accept the impermanence of things. And if you accept the impermanence of things, then rationally you should not attach yourself to them, and you should not attach yourself to people because you know that they're going to die. It doesn't mean you must be cold and aloof, not at all. In fact, this idea says we must love more, not we must love less, but we mustn't confuse love and attachment. Attachment is when we become needy, when we become dependent in some way on that love, when we become dependent on being loved back, or the feeling that that love gives us, the security that knowing that that person loves me gives us, all of those things. So, basically we are terrible at dealing with death. And especially when death arrives in an unexpected way, we act as if death is the most unlikely thing in the world, when in fact it's the only certainty. Makes it the most likely thing in the world. It's the only thing you can be absolutely certain of, is that everyone will die. So we shouldn't act so surprised when death happens. It's rather irrational to act so surprised. So if we've learned not to overly attach ourselves, if we've learned that I must love every day, I must treasure every day and every person and every animal that I have now in my life, because I don't know what's going to happen tomorrow. It's not in my control. I don't know when death is going to come around. That's not in my control. So it's not up to me, and therefore my reaction to that is pointless. Again, at first sometimes people think that that is indifference, that that is being cold in some way, but it isn't. It really teaches you to love in the truest way, in a way that is not dependent on some kind of outcome, and is not dependent on the fact that I love makes me feel secure. Because if what I love or who I love is not there tomorrow, well, then I'm allowing an outside source to control my emotions, if my happiness depends on that. So my happiness must learn to come from within. So ultimately, it is like many of the great Eastern teachings teach us, that it is through detachment that we can appreciate and live most successfully in a world that is not under our control. And as long as we think it is and act like it is, it will push us and pull us and bounce us and bash us. So Stoicism teaches us how to survive in this world that is not so under our control. So that's really just a taste. And in future episodes, we're going to look further at some exercises that will help us take that further, as well as directly at some of the teachings of Marcus Aurelius and of Epictetus to give us very deep and profound wisdom and food for thought. It appeals so well to our rational selves and explains why so many things make us unhappy and therefore how we can find happiness in the meanwhile. You might want to check back on YouTube or Facebook and watch the episode on how to be happy, because that contains a lot of the core Stoic ideas in it as well, but we're going to be getting that in much more detail in many episodes again. So watch out in a few weeks' time for another intriguing idea from the Stoics that will help us become more stable, happier, and perhaps more virtuous people. Meanwhile, I'll be back next week with the month ahead. See you then.